My name is Ruth Bivens, and I was born and raised in San Diego, California. I've been a nun for 23 years, and throughout my life, faith has been the cornerstone. Even as a little child, I understood what it meant to put your trust in God, obey His commands, and live in a way that honors Him. Sundays were holy days spent in the comfort of the church, surrounded by hymns, prayers, and the familiar faces of a congregation that had become family. My faith was more than just something I practiced. It was who I was. One of the lessons that had been ingrained in me since I was a child was tithing, which is 10% of my income. I never questioned this because it was my way of demonstrating obedience, securing blessings, and doing what I had always been taught was right. I never missed a tithe, no matter how hard things got. I felt that my giving was a sign of my devotion, a key that would unlock God's favor in my life, but if I'm being honest, I never really stopped to consider its deeper meaning. As my life progressed steadily throughout the years, I always believed that as long as I did my part, I was fulfilling God's will. But something else started to shift, initially in minor ways. I initially dismissed it as normal aging because everyone forgets things occasionally, like misplacing my glasses or forgetting the names of people I've known for years. However, those moments of forgetfulness quickly escalated into something more concerning, as I would find myself in familiar places and feel lost, repeating the same questions over and over again without realizing that I had just asked them minutes earlier. Whole days seemed to pass by. Moments that I couldn't hold on to no matter how hard I tried. The diagnosis came gently, but the weight of it was severe Alzheimer's. In an attempt to preserve the version of me that was gradually vanishing, my family tried to be strong for me, but I could see the fear in their eyes and hear it in their voices when they spoke to me. I prayed to God, asking Him to give me the strength to preserve my memories and allow me to remain the person I had always been. But no matter how much I prayed, the days became more difficult. Then came the day that changed everything. It was an afternoon like any other, and I was sitting in my favorite chair, the one by the window where I love to watch the world go by, when the sun shone through the glass, casting golden light across the room. I could hear the distant sound of birds outside and the faint hum of the television coming in the background, but I felt more exhausted than usual. A deep, heavy exhaustion that I couldn't quite describe. Shake! I briefly closed my eyes, and in the next breath, I was somewhere else. The confusion had disappeared, the fog that had obscured my thoughts had lifted entirely, the weight of my body, the fatigue, the pain of aging, it had all disappeared. I was standing, though I couldn't recall getting up, and the surroundings were completely different from my home. They were bright, but they were also filled with a light that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't harsh. Unlike the glare of the environment, sun, or the flicker of a lamp, it was warm, gentle, alive. The air itself felt different, almost as if it carried peace within it. I looked down at myself. My hands, once wrinkled and fragile, looked smooth again. I felt strong, weightless, free. Then, as I turned, my eyes met something, or rather, someone, that made my breath catch in my throat. Jesus. He stood before me, and in an instant I knew there was no need for an introduction. No question in my heart about who he was. His presence was overwhelming, not in a way that brought fear, but in a way that filled every part of me with love, so deep, so consuming that I could do nothing but stand in awe. His eyes met mine, and in that moment I felt something I had never felt before. Not just love, but a knowing he saw everything, every thought, every moment, every fear, every prayer I had ever whispered into the silence. I wanted to speak, to ask where I was, to understand what was happening, but before I could form the words, he smiled. "You are home," he said, and in that moment I realized this was only the beginning. For the first time in what seemed like years, I felt totally free as the warmth of his presence enveloped me. I had no fear, no perplexity, no physical pain, and no struggle in the mind. Everything was obvious and made sense. I was standing in a place where everything felt whole and complete, and the weight I had carried for so long was gone. The thought that I had died should have made me feel afraid, but instead I felt more alive than ever before. There was no panic, no sadness, and no sense of loss. Jesus was in front of me, and I could barely breathe from the depth and boundlessness of his love in his eyes. His gentle, steady presence filled every part of me with a peace I had never experienced before. I wanted to tell him that I didn't understand, that I hadn't been expecting this moment, but before I could, he reached out his hand and something amazing happened. My life unfolded before me, not in fragmented memories or faded moments, but in perfect clarity, as if I were watching everything again exactly as it had happened. At first, I saw the beautiful parts, times when I had been kind, times when I had prayed, times when I had lifted my voice in worship with my whole heart. I saw my children, my grandchildren, the people I had loved and who had loved me in return. And for a moment, I felt a sense of peace, thinking that maybe I had done well, that maybe my life had been pleasing to God. But then I saw more. I saw the moments I had ignored someone in need because I was too busy. I saw the times I had judged others in my heart without ever realizing I was doing it. I saw the opportunities I had missed to show love, the moments when I had held on to small grievances instead of choosing grace, and then I saw my tithing. I watched as Sunday after Sunday I placed my money into the offering plate, always making sure to give exactly what had been taught to me, 10%, just as the Bible said. It was a rule I had followed without question, something I had been proud of. I had never failed to give, even in the hardest times when finances were tight. I had remained faithful to that number, but for the first time, I saw my giving in a way I had never seen before. I hadn't been giving out of love. I had been giving out of duty in my heart. I had believed that tithing was a requirement, something I had to do to be in right standing with God, something that ensured I would receive blessings in return if it had turned into a transaction or a way for me to cross something off a list in my faith. But now that I was standing in front of Jesus, I realized that tithing had never been about money. Rather, it had always been about the heart. His gaze never faltered as he allowed me to absorb the full weight of what he was showing me. He wasn't angry or condemning me, but there was something in his face that was both sorrowful and patient. Eventually, he asked, "Do you understand why you are here?" His voice wasn't harsh or demanding. It was gentle and full of love, but it was firm, as if he were pointing me in the direction of an answer that I had never been able to see before. I wanted to respond, but I couldn't because I didn't understand. I had done everything I thought was right. I had lived the way I was supposed to. I had followed the teachings I had been given. I followed the laws, went to church, and gave to others when I could, but as I stood in front of him and saw my life arranged this way, I realized that I had overlooked something crucial. I had been so preoccupied with the act of tithing that I had overlooked the essence of it. Tithing wasn't about numbers. It was about really trusting God and giving up not just a part of my income, but my entire heart. Throughout my life, I had given faithfully but never freely. I had always obeyed the law, but had never paused to consider what God really wanted from me. As I stood before Jesus, my heart swelled with expectation, because for so many years I had been faithful in my giving, making sure that I tithed every Sunday without fail, because I had done what was required and what was expected of a good Christian. Surely he would acknowledge my faithfulness and tell me that I had honored him through my obedience. But that moment never came. Instead, Jesus looked at me with eyes full of love, but also sorrow. Not disappointment, not anger, but a deep sadness that made my spirit tremble. I watched as my life's events continued to play out in front of me, this time concentrating on the many times I had contributed my tithing. I saw myself writing checks to my church and pouring money into the offering plate, giving to ministries. I saw how I had given even in difficult times when finances were tight and sacrifices had to be made. At first I felt a sense of pride. I had done what was right. I had given faithfully. But as the vision continued, something shifted. Jesus wasn't just showing me what I had given, he was showing me my heart. While I gave, I saw myself sitting in church, listening to sermons about tithing, about the importance of giving to receive blessings. I saw the moments when I had felt guilted into giving more, afraid that if I held back, I would be withholding something from God. I saw the times when I had struggled financially, yet still forced myself to give, not because I felt led by love, but because I was afraid that if I didn't, I would lose favor with God. And then I saw the truth that had been hiding beneath it all. I had been giving out of duty, not out of joy. I had treated tithing as a transaction, as if I were placing an order for God's blessings rather than offering a gift from my heart. I had believed that my faithfulness and tithing secured me protection, prosperity, and favor even when I struggled. I held on to the idea that giving my 10% ensured that I had done my part, that God now owed me something in return. But when I stood in front of Jesus, I realized how foolish I had been. Tithing had never been about money. Rather, it had always been about trust, submission, and love. Jesus turned to face me, and his gaze was full of kindness and understanding, but it was also resolute in his truth. "You have misunderstood," he said, and his words pierced my soul. "Tithing is about the state of your heart, not how much you give." As soon as he said that, I felt something inside of me fall apart. I had always considered tithing to be a financial requirement, a rule to follow, and a gauge of faithfulness. I had thought that as long as I gave my share, I was in good standing with God. However, Jesus was demonstrating to me that genuine giving was entirely about surrender. I had given my money, but I had never given my heart. Jesus went on to say, "You have been generous with your offerings, but you have withheld yourself." His words were full of love and truth, and as I realized this, my eyes began to flood up with tears. I had always thought that tithing was a means to demonstrate my loyalty to God, but I now see that loyalty was never about material possessions, but rather total faith in Him. I had trusted the tithing act more than I had put His faith in God. For so long, I had carried the burden of giving out of fear that I wouldn't be in right standing with God, fear of losing favor, and the belief that my giving secured my blessings, rather than believing that God's love and provision were already mine. However, Jesus wasn't looking at my giving the way I had assumed He would. Instead, He was looking at my heart, and I had missed the joy of it. I looked at Him, my voice shaking, and asked, "Lord, what do you want from me?" Tithing was never about a number. It was never about following a rule. It was about living in total trust, knowing that everything I had, my time, my love, and my resources, belonged to Him. Jesus smiled, and in that smile, I felt peace unlike anything I had ever experienced. "I do not want what is in your hands," He said gently. "I want what is in your heart." God had always wanted me to give by surrender, but I had spent my entire life giving by percentage. It was then that I understood I had been missing something much bigger than I had ever experienced. This was not just about tithing, this was about how I had lived my entire life. And as I stood there face to face with Jesus, I knew that everything was about to change. Jesus lifted His hand, and suddenly the scene before me changed. The memories of my life continued to unfold, but this time He wasn't showing me moments inside the church, inside the walls where I had faithfully tithed. Instead, He was showing me something I had never stopped to see. I saw people, so many people walking through their lives carrying burdens that no one else noticed. Some were struggling in silence, desperate for kindness, for someone to acknowledge them. Others were lost in loneliness, longing for a conversation, for someone to remind them that they mattered. And then I saw myself. I saw the countless Sundays when I had placed my offering into the collection plate, feeling secure in my obedience, believing I had done what was right. But as I watched, I realized something painful. I had been so focused on giving to the church that I had completely overlooked the people around me. Jesus started pointing out instances in which I was needed by someone but was too focused on abiding by the rules to see that I was seeing a woman. From the church I attend, a person I had sat next to for years had been having a hard time not crying during church. But I had been so preoccupied with making sure my tithe was in the envelope and anxious to fulfill my religious obligation that I had even had the time to inquire about her well-being. Outside the grocery store, I noticed a man sitting on a bench with weary eyes, worn clothing, and shaking hands. He needed assistance not only materially, but also spiritually. He needed someone to recognize him, to infuse life into him, and to remind him that he was not invisible. I had gone past him without giving it any thought because I thought my financial contribution was sufficient. At a gas station, I saw a young mother struggling with 2 small children. Her frustration was evident as she looked through her purse and realized she didn't have enough money to fill up her tank. I had been there, but I had done nothing because I thought that I already gave to the church, which was how I helped. Then Jesus spoke again, saying gently, "You have given to the church, but you have withheld from my people." His remarks were like a wave that knocked the wind out of my soul. I had tithed because I thought that as long as I was paying my 10%, I was fulfilling God's command, but now I saw that I had missed the true heart part of giving. Tithing was never meant to be just about money. It was meant to be about love, generosity, and trust. I had been faithful in giving my finances, but I had failed to give my time, my kindness, my compassion. I had believed that my responsibility ended when I placed my money into the offering plate, that I had done my part by contributing to the church, but God hadn't just called me to give to an institution, He had called me to give to people. Jesus lifted His hand again, and I saw something even more heartbreaking. I saw people inside my own church who had been struggling, people who had been silently suffering, afraid to ask for help because they felt ashamed. Some had given their last bit of money to the church, believing it was the only way to receive blessings, even though they had nothing left to feed their children. I saw families who had poured everything into their tithes, waiting for a miracle that never came because they had been taught that giving money was the key to unlocking God's favor. I could see the sadness in their eyes and the quiet query in their hearts. Had God forgotten them? There were tears streaming down their faces, down my cheeks when I realized it. In God's heart, love, compassion, and trust were always more important than numbers. He never wanted people to feel burdened by contributing out of necessity or to think that money was the secret to His benefits. Jesus looked back at me. His voice was full of grief, but it was also full of incredible love. I sobbed because true giving is about what you are willing to give of yourself, not about what you put on the offering plate. God had called me to a life of giving my time, encouragement, presence, and love. I had spent years thinking that writing a check was sufficient, but in reality, the people around me had needed me more than my money, and I had not been there. I realized that I had been limited in my generosity with money. Jesus put a kind hand on my shoulder and whispered, "I brought you here because it's not too late to understand." I had missed so much, but now I was finally starting to see that I had always believed that my tithe was my greatest blessing. I gazed at Him with heartbreaking remorse and an overpowering sense of peace, offering, but now I knew that love was the greatest gift I could ever give. As the scene came to an end, I felt a deep stirring in my soul because I knew that Jesus was about to show me something even greater. Then, all of a sudden, everything changed around me. I lost the opportunities I had missed, the people I had overlooked, and the painful realization of what I had misunderstood. Suddenly, I found myself standing in a place so beautiful and radiant that I felt as though my very soul was being lifted into pure joy. The light was unlike anything on earth. It was alive with warmth, peace, and an overwhelming sense of belonging. The air itself carried a presence that felt like love in its purest form. I wasn't just seeing this place. I was feeling it breathe and becoming a part of it. Then I noticed the people everywhere I looked. Their faces were beaming with happiness, and their expressions were filled with a calm that words could never express. They moved in perfect unity, not as strangers or as people divided by differences, but as one who was totally united in love. And that's what really got to me. The most striking thing about their giving to one another was that they did not do so out of duty or obligation. Rather, they gave freely because love flowed from them. They were not constrained by percentages or calculations of how much was enough. Instead, they gave freely, joyfully, completely, without hesitation, without expectation, and without fear of not having enough in return. I watched as people embraced, offering kindness without condition, sharing all that they had, knowing that nothing was ever truly lost. And I suddenly realized something so profound and overwhelming that my breath caught in my throat. This was giving as God had always intended. It had never been about wealth, 10% of transactions, or formulas to unlock blessings. It had always been about the heart, trust, and loving without restraint, without calculation, without fear, and without restriction. As I processed everything, Jesus stood next to me and stated, "My love-filled voice is what I desire for all of my children." Tears flooded my eyes as the words weighed heavily on my soul. Heaven was founded on love, not procedures. The individuals I observed had not come here because they had complied with the regulations, because they had carefully provided their 10%, because they had carried out their religious duties precisely. They were here because they had given their hearts to God. They had loved without boundaries. They had lived with open hands, not holding on to what they had, but trusting that God would provide for everything. And I realized how much I had misunderstood. I had believed that my giving was what pleased God the most, that my faithfulness and tithing had been the mark of my devotion. But God had never needed my money. He had wanted my heart. He had wanted me to trust Him completely, to love others without hesitation. He had wanted me to give not just from my wallet, but from my very soul. I turned to Jesus, my heart full, my spirit overwhelmed with gratitude. I whispered, "I never knew." And He smiled, His eyes full of understanding. I observed how they lived in total freedom, unwavering faith, and unwavering love. They had no worries about scarcity or financial concerns, and they were able to give everything they had ever owned, God. And as a result, they were never without. I had dedicated my life to giving out of necessity, but they had given their lives to giving by surrender. And as a result, they had acquired everything. I felt a profound stirring within me, an unwavering truth settling into my soul. Heaven was not something I could obtain by perfect obedience, observing religious precepts, and making sure I had done everything correctly. Heaven was the outcome of a life spent in love, one that completely trusted God, and one that gave up everything, not just a portion, but the entirety of one's heart. When the scene started to change again, I realized that my journey was far from over. The beauty of heaven vanished, and all around me abruptly changed. The warmth, the peace, the overwhelming love were gone, and a deep, heavy darkness descended upon me. Jesus turned to me again, and I knew that He had something else to show me, something that would reveal the full weight of what was still missing. There was a weight in the air, something unquestionably sorrowful that weighed against my soul, even if I wasn't afraid. When I looked around, I saw people, but their faces were dejected, unlike the ones I had just seen in heaven, tired and weighed down by something invisible but profoundly felt. Some stood by themselves, deep in contemplation. Some people had lived their lives doing all the right things, following the rules, fulfilling their religious duties, but somewhere along the way, they had missed the heart of it all. I saw others who had clung to legalism, believing that their salvation came through obedience to rituals rather than through a genuine relationship with God. I saw others who had lived for themselves, holding on to their possessions, their pride, their status, thinking that as long as they tithed, attended church, and appeared righteous, they had done enough. Finally, I saw people who had given faithfully but had never fully understood what God truly wanted from them. Jesus stood next to me, His face full of love and sorrow. He said, "It is not about what you give," in a steady, meaningful voice. "It is about how you live." His words pierced me, revealing everything I had never let myself see. I had given so much of my life, but I had done it. I had tithed. I had obeyed the rules. I had done what I thought was expected of me, but had I truly lived for God? Had I given Him everything, my trust, my heart, and my complete surrender? I had always believed that my faithfulness was in checking the right boxes and making sure I had followed God's instructions. But now that I was standing here looking at the faces of those who had done the same, I realized that true faith was about living in complete trust, complete love, and complete willingness to follow Him wherever He led. I had assumed that because I tithed, I had done enough, but God had never wanted my money. He had wanted my heart. He had wanted me to trust Him beyond what I could see, to love people beyond what was comfortable to give, not just because I had to, but because I understood the joy of giving everything to Him. With a sorrowful heart, I turned to Jesus. "Have I missed it, Lord?" He said softly. "You have been given another chance." And I felt a warmth fill my chest as His eyes met mine, and I saw in them not condemnation nor disappointment, but a profound, overpowering love. Then I suddenly realized that faith was about love, a love so deep and all-consuming that it couldn't help but pour out freely in every action, thought, and moment of surrender to God. And this was the message Jesus had brought me here to see. The darkness around me started to fade, and I knew that what came next would change my life forever. The sadness of what I had seen still weighed heavily on my heart. But before I could even process everything, the scene started to shift again. The soft glow of the radiant light I had first seen when I arrived replaced the darkness, and Jesus was standing in front of me once more, His presence wrapped around me like a warm embrace, full of love, peace, and what I could only call home. But I could still feel the weight of everything He had shown me, including the misunderstandings, the opportunities lost, and the way I had obeyed the rules but failed to see the true nature of God's love. I looked at Him, my voice shaking, my soul exposed in front of Him. "What happens now, Lord?" As though He knew the exact question I hadn't yet asked, Jesus looked at me tenderly, and His eyes were full of profound understanding. "You have been given another chance," He said softly, and as I understood what He was saying, a warmth began to spread through my spirit. I realized that I wasn't meant to stay here just yet. I had been brought here to learn to understand and see the truth that I had missed my entire life. And now I had a choice. Jesus held up His hand, and suddenly I saw two paths in front of me. One led deeper into this place of light, of peace, of eternal joy, where I would never again experience pain, struggle, or the burdens of worldly life. The other led back to my body and the world I had left behind, where people were still searching, still struggling, still longing for the truth that I had just witnessed. I knew that if I stayed, I would be at peace and be with Him. But I also knew that if I stayed, someone would go back and tell my family, my church, the people I had been sitting next to for years in worship, and let them know that they had been missing something more profound. Then I thought about everyone who still thought that tithing was just a rule, a requirement, or a way to gain God's favor instead of the beautiful act of trust and generosity that it was meant to be. I thought about those who were still giving out of obligation, but not out of love. I thought about those who felt like they weren't doing enough, who were afraid they weren't giving enough, and who lived in fear that God was judging their worth by their offerings instead of by their hearts. I realized then that God wasn't looking for perfection, but rather surrender, and that faith wasn't about numbers, but love. Then, for the first time since I arrived, He smiled and said, "Go and tell them." The light around me grew so bright that I could no longer see, think, or feel anything but pure, overwhelming warmth. And then I gasped for air as my knees buckled beneath me as I fell before Jesus, tears streaming down my face. I whispered, "I choose You not just here, but in life, in everything. I choose You." I felt His hand on my shoulder, steadying me and grounding me in the overwhelming love that radiated from Him. The weight. When I opened my eyes, the world around me felt different. Bright hospital lights flickered above me, and I could hear voices, some urgent, some relieved, all of which seemed distant, as if I were still caught between two realities. I felt the familiar ache in my bones, hands gripping my bones, voices calling my name, and the beeping of hospital monitors filling the air. I was back, and although my body was weak, my heart was stronger than ever before. And I had a message to share. Over me, the doctor was alive. They looked shocked when she returned, and one of them said, shaking his head in surprise, "We had assumed she wouldn't make it." "Mom, you're here," my daughter mumbled, her voice breaking, and I attempted to speak, but my mouth was dry. My family raced to my side, clasping my hand and crying. The doctors called my survival a miracle, but I knew that the true miracle was that Jesus had given me another chance. While I was lying in that hospital, my body felt weak from the weight of what had just happened. Not the weight of my body, but of what I had seen, learned, and been sent back to do. The bed, I could still feel the warmth of his presence. His voice echoed in my heart, steady and clear. "Go and tell them," but how could I possibly explain what I had seen? How could I put into words the overwhelming love, the truth about tithing, the reality that God wasn't after money but after hearts? For days, I wrestled with this. I tried to write down my experience, but the words felt too small, too fragile to hold the weight of what I had witnessed. Every time I tried to explain it in my mind, it felt too big, too much to grasp. But then I remembered something. Jesus didn't tell me to explain it perfectly. He just told me to tell them. So I started first with my family. I told them what had happened, from the moment I closed my eyes in my living room to the moment I found myself standing before Jesus. I told them about the life review, the painful realization that I had given out of duty rather than love, the people I had overlooked, and the truth that tithing was never about money. It was about trust, surrender, and a heart willing to give fully to God. Some of them cried, their hands covering their mouths, their eyes filled with emotion. My daughter firmly squeezed my hand, muttering, "I think you," but others weren't so sure. I noticed the way some of them looked at one another with hesitancy, as though they were waiting for someone to express their thoughts, suggested that it might have been a dream. When I was strong enough, I went to my church and stood in front of the congregation I had worshipped with for so many years. I told them everything, how I had spent my entire life believing I was giving correctly, how I had followed the rule of tithing without ever stopping to understand its deeper meaning, and that God never measured our faithfulness by a percentage, but by the willingness of our hearts to trust. My son finally said, "You've been through a lot, Mom. Maybe your mind was just trying to make sense of everything." I didn't want to offend him, but I understood why he said it. It was easier to believe that this was just a dream than to accept that I had truly stood before Jesus, that I had truly been given this message to share him entirely. I shared with them the people I had missed, the ones I had passed by, and the ones I had ignored because I felt that my donations to the church were sufficient. I also shared with them the vision of heaven, where people gave freely, not out of duty, but because their love overflowed from them. I shared with them the darker place, where people were not condemned, but were burdened with regret, after realizing too late that they had lived their lives checking boxes rather than genuinely giving their hearts to God. Finally, I shared with them what Jesus had taught me. It is not about what you give, but how you live. I heard the whispers, and maybe she had a near-death experience. This doesn't sound like what we've been taught. Tithing is in the Bible, and we have to follow it exactly. I expected this. Not everyone would accept it. Not everyone was ready to hear it, but I wasn't here to convince people. I was here to obey Jesus, so I continued telling my story. Some members of the congregation sobbed openly, their faces buried in their hands, as if something inside them had just roused them. Others sat motionless, their expressions unreadable, as if they were having trouble understanding what they had just heard. The more I talked, the more I realized that people were changing. Some stopped giving out of fear and instead gave out of faith, while others let go of the guilt they had carried because they believed they had to meet a certain standard to receive God's blessings. Others shared it with friends, strangers, and anyone who would listen. Some looked at me with doubt, but many looked at me with hope, as if they had been waiting for someone to put into words the very everything their hearts had been struggling with for years. I finally saw why Jesus had sent me back when I witnessed hearts being set free. This message was never about altering a rule. Rather, it was about altering hearts. Someone somewhere needed to hear this. And as long as I had breath in my lungs, I would tell them, because Jesus had given me another chance, and I would not waste it as I continued to share my story from the bottom of my heart. I didn't need everyone to believe me. I didn't need to defend what I had seen. I just needed to keep talking. I finally realized that tithing was never about money. Rather, it was about giving my life to God completely. I had spent years carefully setting aside 10% of my income because I thought that was what pleased God, but I had missed the deeper truth that God never needed my money. Instead, He wanted my heart. True generosity wasn't about following rules. It was about trusting God so completely that I gave freely, not just of my finances, but also of my time, kindness, and love. I realized that giving wasn't just something we do with our hands. It's something we do with our hearts. I reflected on the individuals I had witnessed in heaven, those who had given freely and lived with open hands rather than just open wallets. They were the ones who had fully comprehended what it meant to give oneself over to God. I then considered those who had lived in regret, those who had given out of duty but had never fully given themselves to God. They had fulfilled their obligations but had missed what mattered. Jesus had shown me both, and now I was left with a choice. I could go back to the way I had lived before, following the rules, but missing the heart of it all, or I could choose to live differently. Not just giving money, but giving myself fully, completely, without fear. Not just writing a check, but writing love into the lives of others. Not just following instructions, but following Jesus with my whole heart. And that is the choice we all must make now. It is up to you. What will you do with this truth? Will you give out of love or out of obligation? Will you live for God fully, not just through rituals, but through true surrender? Jesus isn't asking for more offerings, He's asking for your heart. He is calling each of us to something deeper, not to simply follow rules, but to live in love, to give without fear, to trust that He will always provide. That is the kind of faith that pleases God. That is the kind of generosity that reflects His love to the world. That is what I was sent back to tell you. So now the question remains, will we listen? Thank you for watching. If this message spoke to you, like, share, and subscribe to help spread this truth.